Okay, welcome back, everybody. And for those of you that are beginning with us this afternoon, welcome to you all. This is the continuation of the 12th conference of the International Conference on Jewish Medical Ethics, hosted by Torah in Motion. It's really a pleasure to see some of the faces that we have recognized over the years and some new faces. And God willing, as the theme has been, we hope to get together, God willing, Emir Hashem, all together at a conference number 13, our Bar Mitzvah year. This morning we had the focus on some of the halachic and medical issues that come up during Corona. One of the unfortunate side effects that we have learned from this entire virus situation is not just the medical and halachic aspects, but a lot of the care and the social and the pastoral care, what people have had to have gone through. It's difficult, as we heard this morning, from a halachic perspective, to say that there is a halacha that one is not allowed to do bikur cholim. Halachas about people that had to be, there are the halachic side of it, but there's the personal side of it, of people that were in ICUs on respirators without families. People that were the other side of the spectrum, that were enjoying bris, or they reached milestones, weddings, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. And this past 10 weeks has really been very trying on both ends of those spectrums. And for this topic, we thought we would want some professionals to address it. And for this, we called upon Dr. Michelle Friedman and Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner. Michelle Friedman has been at our conference before many a time, and really a wonderful pleasure to always hear her speak. She is an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. She holds the Stephen and Marilyn Lieberman Chair in Pastoral Counseling at Yeshiva Chovei Torah. She received her MD from NYU and completed advanced training at Columbia. She is a psychiatrist by training who focuses on the Jewish community and has special interest in the rabbinate and pastoral counseling, and is also herself an author. Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner is on the West Coast, Senior Rabbi and Director of Spiritual Care at Cedar Sinai in Los Angeles, and has a lot of hands-on experience in the topics that we have been, that I introduced. He is the rabbi of the Knesset Israel Synagogue and an author of a wonderful work, and I really encourage you to, anybody out there with medical or otherwise, to explore Jewish Guide to Practical Medicine Decision-Making, really a very hands-on kind of a resource. So I will turn it now to our speakers and look forward to, they will do the same as always. We'll have our questions on the chat, and the speakers will go ahead first, and then we will reserve some time at the end for some questions. Dr. Friedman.
Actually, my colleague, Dr. Jason Weiner, is going to be speaking first.
Oh, okay.
So he'll explain how we set up this format. So Perfect. Go ahead, Rev. Jason.
Okay. Great. I had a 50-50 chance, right?
Sorry.
Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction and for having us. I'm a huge fan of Torah in Motion and all of the incredible work that you do. And so it's really quite an honor to be here with you at this time. I'm so impressed by this conference already today, and everything that you do. And it's quite an honor to be here with my teacher, Dr. Friedman, as well. That's really special. Basically, and I'll let her speak first off, but both of us, we have no conflicts to state, and our learning goals are primarily, for myself, I will be sharing, we're going to break up our time, our hour or so between the two of us into like 10, 15 minutes slots. So I'll speak for about 10 minutes, give her a chance to respond, and we can look in the chat box and see if there's any questions. Then she'll speak for 10 minutes and I might respond or see what questions come up. And we'll go back and forth like that throughout the hour, so we can have little pieces. And my focus will be first to give a little bit of a glimpse into, as a chaplain, as someone on the front lines in a sort of different way than the doctors and nurses, to share what it's been like these past few months and just give an impression for some of the spiritual struggles that we have faced. And then to share some strategies in my second presentation about my second 10-minute slot about new ways and some old ways that we have tried to utilize to help people cope with this complicated time. So I'll begin with sharing some stories just to give an impression about what some of the things that we have encountered, really focusing on the emotional and spiritual at this time. And it really goes back to early March for me when this was new and it was just hitting Los Angeles in particular, where I am. We had our first death, our first coronavirus death right at the beginning. And normally it's very common in a hospital to call for a chaplain when someone dies. There was some confusion, like what can the chaplain do? What are we able to provide at this time? But this was an Orthodox patient, and I am, with all my stories, going to change some minor details, obviously for confidentiality, but nothing that will change the essence of what the points I'm trying to make. So as I went up, in fact, I remember showing up in the ICU and the security guard there, the kind of de facto person that had been stationed outside, saying, "Oh, no, sorry, only essential workers right now." And so I said, "Okay." I turned around. I guess I'll call them and guide them by phone. And then the nurse manager sees me walking away. She says, "Where are you going? We just called for you, Rabbi. We need the chaplain in here right now. You're front line. You're essential." So it was like already there was like this confusion about what counts as essential and what's first front line. And it was already, we recognized, there's a lot of unknown here because this is new. So I came into the ICU at our hospital. I'm sure like many, there is green tape on the floor and red tape on the floor. Inside, whatever it has the green tape meant that it's currently clean. Whatever was inside of the red tape has been exposed. So they're asking us, stay inside the green tape and don't touch anything. If you touch something, it has to go to the red tape. And first thing I noticed was that the IV lines, they had extended the patient's IV line so that the IV pole could be outside of the room. So you can imagine, as a chaplain, the first thing I'm thinking is, wow, the isolation that these patients are going through. Not only can their family not be here, but there's almost never anyone in the room with them, not even to change the IV line, because it's now 10-foot lines and the patient's just by themselves with people working on them from outside of the room. So it really hit me at that moment. But at this moment, as this patient was dying, the nurse was in the room trying to tend to him. And she says to me, she calls me. So I'm outside the room, but looking right at her, and I'm on the phone. And she says to me, "So Rabbi, the family said, please call the rabbi. We want to make sure that the Jewish customs are done before this patient dies. I don't know what they are. That's why you're here. You can't come inside the room, but can you guide me from outside?" In the ICU, the rooms are, the doors are glass. So I'm looking through the door and I said, "Well, maybe could you put the phone on speakerphone and hold it to his ear?" So she holds it up and I said, "Vidui." And the patient was still alive at that time. And I kind of stood there and then said some Tehillim, and she was holding the phone as she was working with the patient. And then I noticed from outside, and she made it clear, the patient then died. And after he died, she then says to me over the phone, but right outside the room, "So what next? What do you do now when patients who have asked for Jewish rituals to be engaged in, what happens next?" So I remember saying, "Well, I don't know if you're allowed to do what happens next, but I mean, normally I would close the eyes, close the mouth, straighten the arms. There's a whole list of rituals that we do when someone dies, but can you do this for a coronavirus patient?" And remember, this is early March still. And she said, she looks at me through all of her PPE, and she's looking at me through the window and says, like, "I have no idea if I'm allowed to." So we called the nurse manager. Is she allowed to close the eyes? And she says, "I don't know." So on the spot, we're trying to figure out, I got chills at that moment. I thought, we're all figuring this out as we're going. We're in the midst of crisis, and we're just trying to do the best that we can. And I was so impressed that the nurse, then she did do it. She straightened out the arms, opened the hands up. That's the minhag, closed the eyes. And the family was especially comforted to know that this had happened with their loved one. And then I remember I went down to my office after that, and I get a call from someone who was frantic and in crisis. And I hear panting in the background. And she explains to me, "Rabbi, I have my daughter here. She's expecting. She still has a ways to go, but she has now tested positive for COVID. Her husband has tested positive. And we were told that in such a case, when she comes in to deliver, they will take the baby away for 2 weeks from the second the baby is born. And my daughter is now going into a panic attack. And because of that, I think she's in labor, but she refuses to go to the hospital because she had a friend as a child who, there was this whole story that they had a child who was switched at birth, and that's been her biggest fear for her life. And now she's thinking this is going to happen to her. She won't go to the hospital. What do we do? And I remember thinking, I never imagined. I mean, we were already debating, like, what's the triage going to be? Can you extubate? All these questions we were talking about, these interesting ethical questions. I never imagined these questions. And all of a sudden they were having to be decided immediately. And I remember even saying to one of the chaplains who was standing near me at the time, like, we are in uncharted territory now. We got to figure out what to do. And we got to provide confidence and compassion and guidance, because this is scary, and we don't know what each phone call is going to bring, because it's bringing something different and unexpected. Luckily, we were able to call the head of our maternity department, and she was able to come up with a protocol on the spot to tell the people, come in, deliver your baby. You will get to keep the baby. We'll figure out how to do this, but come in and do the right thing. Deliver your baby in the hospital, and we'll make sure that your baby is not taken away from you. And in fact, that was what happened. But it was just another expression of this fear and uncertainty in the moment. And then, I began to encounter as a chaplain, and I'll share in my second remarks in a few minutes, kind of some strategies. But then began the most challenging and difficult kind of, which is still happening to this day, element of this pandemic, which is, that hospitals and nursing homes and other facilities for very good public health reasons have eliminated visitors from entering. In almost all cases, have not allowed visitors to be in the hospital. And the amount of distress and trauma that this also leads to, first of all, it really increases the job of a chaplain. We're trying to take some of the burden off of the nurses who are really on the front line bearing this burden, and we're trying to provide that support and bring in things for the patient, do whatever we can. But really, for some people, it's really, really difficult. They want to be there for their loved one in their difficult times. And most touchingly, I remember there was one woman who came in for an emergency surgery. They allowed her husband to come in for the surgery just to escort her in. But the second she went into the surgery, he had to leave. So, and he was really upset. So they called me to try to help calm him down and walk him out. And as I'm escorting him out, I saw he was really, really distraught about this. And the woman had a good prognosis. And at one point, he kind of turns to me and he says to me, Rabbi, I'm younger than him. He says to me, I don't know if you're going to understand this, Rabbi, but we've been married for 65 years. And in 65 years, we've never spent one night in a different bedroom. Tonight will be the first time ever my wife is going to be in a hospital in the middle of a pandemic. And it's going to be our first time apart. Can you understand how difficult this is for him? He was breaking down. I felt so horrible for him. And it just struck me this. And I even called some senior leadership in the hospital. Can we make an exception? And they said, we can't make exceptions. I mean, we're going to start making exceptions for one. And it's not fair. We can't make any exceptions. This is a public health crisis. So we started calling him every day, doing FaceTime, visiting her every day, making sure that, he felt connected. But gosh, I mean, the level of spiritual distress and trauma, and that's just one story. I mean, it's so sad. But before I turn it over to Dr. Friedman, just to share one more story, just to give us sort of a feel for kind of the level of struggle that has been involved with this, but also to end, to be Messiah B'davar Tov, as they say, to end on a positive note, because there is a lot of positive, especially now as we're looking forward to, things improving. That first patient that I went to, that we said Vidui over the phone outside of the room. I felt like being there outside of the room, we believe Kabbalistically, I guess, that, for when the soul leaves the body, it's very scary, just like the neshama doesn't want to enter a body. The Pirkei Avos says, right, it doesn't want to leave the body. And part of it's because it gets used to being in the body. So we believe that having family, loved ones, people nearby the deceased, when their soul leaves the body, is comforting for the soul. That's why we try to have someone by the bedside when someone dies, when possible. So I felt like standing outside of the room when the family couldn't, at least having someone standing there saying Tehillim, hopefully was beneficial for the deceased. That's why I tried to stand there. I could have said Vidui from my office also, but I felt like it was something beneficial about that. So I did that another in the course of, March and April and the beginning of May, but really through April, probably 15 times. And I can tell you, and this is just for me, I hope part of the legacy of the coronavirus, and I don't want to down, I mean, this is a very serious virus and deadly virus and something we have to be extremely careful about. But after that first one, every single patient that I said video with afterwards survived. So much so that this past Friday, I got a text from a family member of one of them saying, "Do you remember when you said video with my mother? I just wanted you to know she's home now for Shabbos, and we're looking forward to having Shabbos dinner together." It's amazing. And of course, I give some of the credit to tefillah and the incredible medicine that, we got lucky in Los Angeles in a way that we've had a lot of patients, but not the same type of intense, overwhelming numbers that hit New York very suddenly. So we were able to be a little bit more prepared, and hopefully that led to better outcomes. But it's really, when I start to look back on this and think to myself, wow, a lot of people who we thought were going to die and were within minutes of dying. And I was told, they're dying right now. Come say the prayers. And they survived. And I, as a chaplain, I've never had this kind of rate where people are surviving after VDOI. It's really incredible. And to me, it's really one of hopefully the positive legacies of this, that a lot of people who are very really on the verge of death made it. And I thank God it's really special. And I hope that stays that way with anyone who still gets sick. I hope that they all have as good of outcomes. Dr. Friedman, any
I think what I'm going to do is go right into what I was going to talk about in my 15 minutes, because it connects exactly to what you just spoke about. So maybe what I'll do is go into that, and then we'll have a few minutes of discussion from the community, after that. Because, this morning we were privileged to hear a great deal about the medical the medical conundrums and the tremendous difficulties, but there was a lot of technology and science that we talked about applying, whether it was allocation of ventilators or whether or not plasma transfusion was going to work, all that kind of stuff. What we're talking about now is the application of a very different kind of modality, and that's basically active, compassionate, non-judgmental listening and spiritual care. And it just gave some really beautiful vignettes. What I want to do in my time, and I think that's why I said it connects so much to what you talked about, is to look at the impact of this pandemic on the caregivers. So I want to talk about, like, there you were. I mean, you were so impassioned, Jason, talking about what it was like and ending on a hopeful note. There's so many out there. There are the chaplains in the hospital, and really of all faith traditions, this would apply to. Certainly the medical caregivers, the doctors, the nurses, the respiratory technicians, the people, the transporters, all these people who are used to functioning in a hospital environment that works in a certain way. Of course, there's always morbidity and mortality, but never in anybody's lifetime in the kind of acute, traumatic, sudden, just kind of this tsunami of tremendous distress. I should also say that I'm speaking from New York, so I live on the Upper West Side, and I have 3 daughters. The older 2 are married to doctors, and the third is a psychiatry intern who was deployed to an all-COVID unit in the Bronx. So I wasn't on I'm too old to be deployed to medicine myself, but I was definitely hearing the stories firsthand, through my kids. And also what I tried to do in a way of service was convening support groups for first responders, mostly really for rabbis and other chaplains. So that's where my this material that I'm talking about is coming from, and very much supported by what Jason just said. So the negatives, I would say, let me take that back. The challenges that this group of first responders, and again, I'm including the spiritual responders, the chaplains, and also the people in the community, rabbis in the community who might not actually work full-time in a hospital, but are getting calls and texts and all that, educators in the community who are hearing about the distress of kids who have relatives who are sick, who are home from school, there's all kinds of distress going on. So I really want to broaden this community of Jewish spiritual first responders. First of all, there were so many unknowns about the virus altogether. And the whole uncertainty, as Jason just beautifully illustrated, particularly with that case of the pregnant woman, What was the degree of contagion? People were so fearful, and we continue to be and should be fearful and respectful of the power of this virus. As Rav Glatt pointed out so powerfully towards the end of his talk, it's not over. We're entering a different phase, but we really have to be careful. But the fear for safety itself, that I think was a number one thing that people who went into medicine, into nursing, into all the other fields, we didn't go into it expecting that our lives would be in danger. Now you thought about it during, I'm old enough to have been around during the AIDS crisis. Were you going to do CPR on somebody with AIDS? Well, doing that was actually quite different than somebody with COVID. So the fear for safety for oneself and the potential contamination of beloved family members or friends was very, very real and very unknown. Certainly in New York and other places, the lack of PPE, personal protective equipment, was very dire and very frightening. And it added a sense of chaos to a situation that was already medically unclear. So the anxiety about that was first and foremost. For people who were used to working in medicine, the anxiety about making the right decision was huge. Was it the right thing to do? Nobody knew how this virus worked. We still really don't understand a lot about it. How to do oxygen. Should patients be on their backs? Proning the patients turned out to be really a positive thing, but there was so much anxiety in practicing medicine. People were practicing medicine and nursing and everything else in ways that they had never encountered before. So that whole sense of anxiety about, am I doing this right? Am I upholding what I went into this field? And I certainly believe that people go into medical care and into rabbinus and into chaplaincy because they want to do good, was very, very distressing. That connects a lot to anger. The anger about not having PPE, the anger for many people about the political system, whether it was the politics of their hospital political system, their government political system, world leaders fighting with each other, governors fighting with trying to get the ventilators from different states, all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of anger that was all floating around at the same time as this kind of as all these other very, very powerful feelings. The guilt at feeling like, what am I doing? So many patients die at the same time. Am I making the right decision? All of that kind of stuff. And I think that there was a certain amount of spiritual, certainly doubt, if not collapse. And I spoke to well-meaning, excellent chaplains who felt like, I don't know what my mission is. I'm supposed to help people. I'm supposed to give hope, but what am I really doing? I'm outside, as Jason said, so people were outside of ICUs where the walls weren't glass, where it was opaque, where they were the only chaplain left. I spoke to one of our Muslimachim who was a chaplain in a hospital. His co-chaplain was gone because the guy had a heart transplant, so he certainly wasn't going to be in the hospital. And this chaplain was alone. He was in a room by himself with a telephone. I want to read something from one of my groups. This is actually from a priest who had been a policeman himself for 20 years, and then he went into the priesthood. But he wrote this that I thought, really it could be written by anybody. As a cop for 20 years, I have never felt such strong feelings of anxiety and depression and such he's a chaplain, this guy's a hospital chaplain, powerful feeling of not doing enough from a ministerial perspective, even though he's doing all kinds of services and all kinds of things. In my 10 years in ministry, just substitute rabbinus, I have done countless funeral services, but this time was very different and even scary. Being present for people often for me means holding their hands or just being close, sitting next to them, all these things that Rav Jason just talked about. And then he wrote, it's being so far away was from the chief. It was a police chief's funeral, was so sad and even wrong in my own mind spiritually, even though I recognize the safety needs for everyone, including myself. And then he goes on, but in a way I was very thankful because I was afraid of getting the virus myself since I have two major health factors, but even that is causing me to feel tremendous guilt. So I guess, and this is a wrap here, the most challenging concern I have is feeling lost and confused in this, when I am supposed to be giving hope and help to those in need. So this is from a hospital chaplain. And I heard things like that from doctors, from nurses, from people who were working in the system. So what's the positive side to this? What is the actual, when people say, what, Michelle, should I just listen? And I say, wait a second, think about that word just, because just is sort of a diminishing word. The power of active, compassionate, non-judgmental listening with a spiritual component to it is enormous. And people need to be reminded of this again and again, especially during a crisis. And this is a crisis that none of us have lived through because it is extended. It's gone on for weeks and months, and we don't know where it's going. So what I want to go to, and this will be the end of what I'm going to close with, is the enormous power that joy might be not exactly the first word I would use, but the positive is the enormous potential for seeing how powerful validating people's feelings are. Not judging the anger, not judging the guilt, not judging the whatever it is, the fear, but like saying, like I'm sure as what Jason said to this man who had never slept a night away from his wife for 65 years, that is a beautiful thing to hear. That is really a remarkable marriage. Can you tell me your secret? Whatever you said. And I think to validate what people's own sources of resilience are and their achievements. Very often we look to, we have a tendency to sometimes pathologize when what we want to do is also support the resiliency. Another thing I really want to say that I think is so doable, not particularly expensive, really just takes organization, but the longer term support, constructing niche support groups for people who have worked in these different fields. I mean, people who worked as morgue attendants in hospitals really saw things that they had never seen before. Now, we talked about in the Jewish community and the Torah in Motion community, there's a lot of internal support. There's a lot of warmth, and I think that, a close community. But a lot of people don't have that, many Jews included. And I think constructing short-term support groups for people, medical workers, for teachers. I mean, it's very tough to be teaching remotely, and trying to convey what the meanings of lessons are. But I think that's constructing support groups for people to be able to talk out what they experienced and to feel that other people had the same kinds of experiences or similar experiences, and to be able to do, as we're talking now, share strategies is a remarkably helpful thing for people who are going through a crisis. We're talking and this is what I'm going to end with. What this pandemic has done, it's magnified what's already there. The virus is new in our lives, and certainly some of the crisis situations that it's imposed have been unprecedented. But the human experiences, none of them are new. They're magnified, they're accentuated, and people are really tremendously stressed. We didn't have, I'll go a little bit into the next section possibly. We're not even talking about economic stress. That is going to be touched on later today. We talked about impact on the Jewish community. But there's so many aspects that have been stressful. And what I want to end with in a hopeful way is, I think there's a big difference between being stressed and being traumatized. Some people have been traumatized, and whether or not there's going to be higher rates of PTSD and all that kind of stuff, we have yet to see. But we know that we can alleviate a lot of that really painful residue by giving group support and validation of people's experience and sharing strategies and coping. So I'm going to end here. I think this might be a good time to open up the chat. Jason, you want to moderate that? I see we have one person. We have three. Go ahead.
There's the question for me about advanced directives I'll deal with in a moment, but I think there was an interesting question that maybe you could respond to, Dr. Friedman, about helping people with PTSD-like symptoms, staff members on the front lines, how they can cope in the long term.
I think that, I know here in New York, what we've certainly seen is the availability of low fee or no fee mental health support. Now, I was addressing my comments to chaplains, rabbis, educators who are not themselves, let's say some are mental health, but most are not mental health professionals. I have I obviously wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't believe in the tremendous power of spiritual first responders. But I think in terms of the PTSD situation, for people who have symptoms, I think the availability of low fee or no fee and easy access to people who can really sort through those symptoms and help people with symptoms of whatever it is, like severe anxiety, insomnia, loss of appetite, increased maybe, I don't know, use of alcohol or stuff like that is really important.
Yeah, excellent. And our H here, I see, asked a very poignant question, or was making an important point about, this person works in palliative care and is focused on being there for people in their time of need, but is now not allowed to because the hospitals have closed off. And this is a time when people experience such fear and anxiety, but yet don't have as much support. So actually, maybe that will lead me right into the comments that I was going to make now, and then we'll discuss more. But because and I agree that it's very sad and it's very difficult right now at this difficult time. The fact that there's less people to support patients is obviously.
I just want to say one thing. I just saw the end of the other person's comment about PTSD, and there was a reference to the suicide, and there were 2 suicides at least of doctors in New York. I think it's a tragedy whenever there's a suicide. Suicide is a rent in the human story that is really not like anything else. But I am reluctant to say more about that because we don't know that woman's story. And I know it was ascribed to her distress with her COVID experience, but I don't know anything about her or her life story. And I don't want to jump to, oh, that could happen to anybody who is, I assume, I don't know, as I said, I don't know anything about this woman's story, that maybe she was struggling with things before. And again, this magnified, this widened, whatever stressors, a crack, that we all have cracks inside, but whatever this woman was struggling with. So I would really I want to slow down that, like, escalate that arc, like, oh, this could happen if it gets bad enough.
Well said. Important point. Thank you. And regarding the struggles in hospitals, just like that first day, when I kind of made my way to the ICU and there was a little bit of confusion, like, are chaplains considered essential? Are we frontline? Are we allowed in?
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of disagreement at first. And we have different, networks of chaplains, and we had been asking at first. After that, a few chaplains asked, are you considered essential in your hospital? And I would say 90% of the hospitals said yes. So hopefully the person who asked that question, hopefully at least there's a chaplain or someone at that hospital who they can lean on. I'm not saying that can replace every other professional, but that there's someone whose job it is to focus on people's spiritual, emotional well-being during this time. And they should feel comfortable leaning on them now and saying, here's the things that I need help with. Can you help me while you're there in the front line? And some of it is distance. And this is a challenge with chaplains as well, with everyone, I'm sure. Some of our chaplains are older or have risk factors and don't want to be there, but still want to be helping. And so we've had to figure out, for example, how we can do spiritual care remotely and with technology. So, for example, one of the ways that as chaplains we normally get referrals is by attending interdisciplinary progression of care rounds. That's what we call it at our hospital. Maybe there's different names other places, but rounds in the morning, and just listening in. First of all, we hope that our presence in the group of professionals will help them to just kind of jog their memory that, like, oh yeah, this person might have spiritual or emotional needs in addition to their physical needs. And then also our job is to just be listening, and they say something like, that sounds like it might be a spiritual distressor. And our job is to then speak up and say, hey, you think a chaplain could be beneficial in this case? But we're not having those types of rounds right now, or we're not being able to notice. So we are using very careful assessment of chart notes. And we have chaplains who want to be there, but can't, as I said. So we say, you know what? Yeah, I have a job for you. Go through the chart notes of patients very carefully and let us know when you see something. If you see something in a patient that might be a spiritual distressor, and you come across something like, oh, this patient's partner is calling very frequently, or this person is expressing concern about an upcoming holiday, or and let us know, and then we'll send a chaplain in to try to assess in person or try to assess by phone. But we're using the charts to kind of comb through and determine spiritual distressors, which is kind of a new modality for us, but something that has bared some fruit. Also proactively reaching out to family. sometimes, I mean, we know patients are isolated, family could use support. Sometimes we're hearing from nurses, I'm so busy, this person calls me 3 times a day, I can't call them back every time. So sometimes we say, hey, let us call. If there's just general, updates or support, we can be the ones to call, and we can listen to them as they share their concerns. Of course, doing that has to be done very carefully, because when they hear, they answer the phone, they see it's the hospital calling, and then immediately they hear, it's the chaplain or the rabbi calling. The first thing they think is like, oh no, they're calling to tell me that they died. So obviously we have to be very careful in how, usually before we even introduce ourselves, we say, I'm calling to give a general update. Everything's okay. I'm the rabbi here. I'm here to talk, before they even hear, this, by the way, we learned, I learned early in my career when I would walk into patients' rooms and I would start saying, hi, I'm the rabbi here, and I just want to see how you're doing. And they would say, well, first of all, I'm not doing good. I'm in a hospital. And now I'm really not doing good because what, did you just come to tell me that I'm going to die? Like, why are you here, Rabbi? So I thought, okay, I need to change my script. And I sort of changed it to a little bit like, instead of I'm the rabbi here and I want to see how you're doing, something more like, hi, I'm just making my rounds right now. Wanted to come wish you well. Something to make it more clear that it's sort of general, and I'm just here for a positive thing. I'm here to give to you, not to take from you, to help make people, calm down a little bit. Anyways, that's the side point. But even in person now, though, it's very complicated because we're wearing PPE. Everyone's wearing face masks, patients included, at the minimum. If it's not in addition to face masks, then also the screens. I'm not sure what it's called, actually. The screens, I saw someone actually in the chat, in the group, is wearing one right now, at least. So, it's really hard. And also the body coverings. I mean, it's much more difficult to rely on visual clues and cues that normally, body language that normally when we're talking to someone, and really as chaplains, our main role is to listen. What's Dr. Friedman's line? Wait, why am I talking, right? Just listen. Our role is to listen, to provide compassionate, non-anxious presence. And it's much more difficult though when you can't have this body language. You're not sure what people are saying. And so they can't see your empathy. First of all, they can't really see that you're being a good listener. And when you're talking, you can't really assess visually how they're responding. So we have to develop new techniques and new skills, like focusing very carefully on the rate of their speech, or being, the tone. And this is with strangers. So sometimes that's difficult, and then not making assumptions. Oh, this person must be very distraught now. But then just being very forward and saying, it sounds to me like that's making you upset, or it sounds to me like this is troubling for you, or something to actually be very forward in eliciting emotional responses. Being comfortable with long pauses, finding other ways to affirm that we're listening without interrupting, like nodding our head, or doing something to show them, I'm with you, I'm listening right now. Some people, I know at our hospital, and probably at others, are trying to develop other methods as well. Like I know some people created window masks where you can actually see their mouth. I know that the people who made that did that for patients who are hearing impaired so they could lip read, but it can be beneficial in lots of ways. And not everyone has that, but there's an interesting creative solution. And then this also leads to, obviously, as Dr. Friedman was talking about, and we'll talk more about, I think, greater focus on self-care for staff, really giving them permission to take a break, to take a breath, to do things for themselves, recognizing the emotional stress on their bandwidth that this requires. We've been making videos in our department, 3-minute max. We've made already 50 videos throughout our hospital being texted to staff, and who want to come to prayer services, whether it's Yizkor or Mass or whatever, different religions, guided meditations, Reiki, things like that, to help them have little quick breaks. Also, this thing we do called Tea for the Soul, going up to the units and bringing a break, literally, cookies and tea, and sitting there in the break room, obviously socially distanced, but saying like, hey, we're here to just like hang out for a little bit and take a break. Your manager gave you permission that for the next 2 hours, people should come in here and just take a break at some point. That permission is beneficial. Listening to their concerns that they have, trying to ask questions. Oh, tell me more about what you're experiencing right now. Really providing that space and that emotional sort of permission, and to support them after having provided such difficult support to patients and families. Because what we're finding is that nurses in particular, but many healthcare providers, are providing the type of support that normally chaplains or others had provided, whether it's end-of-life rituals or calling families or listening to difficult stories. And so we're trying to tell them like, oh, this is something that we can relate to you on. Please share with us. How has it been for you? What are some of your struggles? and really being intentional about caring for staff and recognizing, as Dr. Friedman pointed out, how difficult this is for them. Regarding, and then we'll begin turning to some of the questions, and then I'll return it back to Dr. Friedman regarding the question about advanced directives. So the question was related to, like, should people be composing advanced directives differently as a result of this? And I'll just share with you my approach to advanced directives, because it doesn't really change based on this, but it does impact it. So my approach to advanced directives, and the truth is I created an advanced directive based on this approach, but you can use lots of different advanced directives and modify it, is to, instead of going through the old style advanced directive, which was, you list your name and your surrogate, and then a whole list of interventions that you check basically yes or no, I do want, I don't want, and you list them all, and then you submit that to your healthcare provider. The problem with that, it's good. It's always good to have an advanced directive. That's important. That's key. But listing out a person's wishes and desires when they don't know, hopefully you fill it out when you're healthy and you don't know what illness, this will be needed for. And hopefully it won't be for many years. It could be 20 years, 40 years, 50 years. Things could be different. You don't know what interventions you'll need, what you won't need, what you want, why, what the circumstances are. And so it's sometimes dangerous to lock yourself in to certain interventions in an advanced directive. And therefore, instead, I encourage people to simply make sure that an advanced directive includes, obviously, all of their own information, their surrogate, and listing first, number one, here's who you should ask. If they're not available or not, around at that time, here's number two, number three, and then if Jewish law is important to you, here is my rabbi and or institution, meaning maybe my synagogue, maybe I'll outlive my rabbi, but here's the institution who you can contact. And then either in the advanced directive or as a rider attached to it, here's a general description for my non-binding to my rabbi, my healthcare providers, of generally what my perspective is on what I would want. I'm following Jewish law, I'm following my family, you'll make the decision, but you should know that I would or wouldn't want in general some of these things, and you'll make the decisions case by case as it comes up so that I'm not locked in. So what I tell people is, think about it a little bit. I sometimes give them documents to look through think about if you have strong feelings about something. So this would be an opportunity right now, this situation, to think about more situations that you have feelings about. And if you do have strong feelings, to then let your surrogate and or rabbi know about those things, but not necessarily to list them all very specifically, because hopefully and likely circumstances will be different once your advanced directive is needed. So we can turn to any questions or comments before we go back to Dr. Friedman's points.
I think I got most of the questions now. Dr. Friedman, then we'll take a few more questions right at the end.
Great.
Okay. So I'm going to go to my next material. And what I want to do now is I want to focus on a little bit on individual type of experiences. And I'm kind of going along the life cycle. And somebody brought in the experience of Holocaust survivor and transmission to second generation. As a child of survivors, I am happy to talk about that full time. So I will definitely get to that point as well. But what I want to really want to emphasize, and again, our topic is grief and joy and pastoral care. So I'm really addressing myself to pastoral care to individuals outside of a hospital setting. So whether they're contacting their rabbi or it's really a friend to friend. I mean, there's I'm thinking of this as like a first responder response. Maybe somebody's calling up the principal of their kid's school, or calling up their rabbi, or they're speaking to, a trusted person. But I'm now outside of the medical establishment, but addressing concerns and life situations that people are really having a hard time with. And the overall picture of this is, out in addition to everything I talked about before, the anxiety, the fear, the guilt, everybody is experiencing a huge degree of isolation and be a gap. Like life stopped in a certain way. Now, for some people, that had a silver lining. They got to play board games with their kids. They were at home, all that kind of stuff. And again, I'm not addressing, although we all want to acknowledge the enormous financial and other kinds of concerns that go along with this. But now I'm talking about the sort of like time stopped for a lot of people. And one group I just want to bring in one other sort of general point, and that's the whole issue of trust. This is something that has infiltrated, and understandably so. Do I trust another family's level of isolation? Can my kids play with their kids? Is it okay to visit my mother in her independent living facility? Am I clean enough? Do I trust that somebody else washed their hands properly? This whole thing, as sophisticated as we want to be, and we know we're not like outside the machaneh with some kind of, plague, that this infiltrates, like it feels like who has the cooties, and it is a distressing, and it can cause, I mean, I was in CVS buying a birthday card, and I was next to somebody else, and I was looking for a specific kind of birthday card, and this lady yells at me, and we're all wearing masks. This is in Manhattan. Stop following me. I wasn't following her. I was trying to find the birthday cards for a certain occasion, or whatever, for a certain relative. And it was and I felt like myself stiffening, and I wanted to bark at her. I'm not following, whatever. But it's like, we're all on edge. And I think that kind of whole trust issue is very pervasive. Did somebody get too close to you, in the supermarket? Did X, Y, or Z? Okay, a population I want to acknowledge are the singles. And, many of them, I mean, some people have roommates, but many are living alone. And certainly people who are young singles, middle-aged singles, older singles, living alone during a pandemic is truly isolating. And for people who, and I have a number of working with private patients like this, who wanted to be dating, talk about like a freeze of things. There's only so far that things are going to get on, Zoom chats, or maybe you could have a socially distanced walk in Central Park or something like that. But this is obviously, I'm not talking about the very formal shidduch community, which might be more used to this kind of thing. But singles who feel like, wait, I'm already 32, I'm already 34, and how long is this going to be? When can I connect with somebody? When can I go out on a date? How close can you sit to somebody? Can you touch somebody, etc.? So I really do want, is somebody infectious? And going back to some of our earlier talks, if somebody was had a positive, COVID thing, are they okay, or can you trust it? Again, the trust word comes in, comes all along the path here. I was working with a young woman who gave birth sometime in November. She was having a very hard time postpartum. This is an area that I've worked with, postpartum anxiety and depression. And she was really struggling. And then lo and behold, her father, who lived at some distance away, contracted COVID and died of it. So here she was, struggling with her postpartum stuff. All of the issues that we all know about with funerals on Zoom, shivas on Zoom, all that kind of stuff was really agonizing for this young woman. And she really kind of fell into a rabbit hole of it spiraled downward. Now, would it have been the same had all of these things not conspired together? Would she have been as distressed? Would she have as hard a time? But people going through just life transitions, even the most joyous of having a baby. But these people, like literally today at 4 o'clock, one of our students is getting married. Now that's a wonderful, joyous event, but it's going to be a tiny ceremony with, Zoom, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's important to acknowledge people's loss, the mourning of what they didn't have. People who dreamed of having the beautiful wedding that their friends had only maybe 6 months ago. And their choice is to postpone it indefinitely or to have a smaller version now. Now, everybody knows that being able to get married and to have your near and dear present and alive and well is such a bracha. Like, how dare you complain that you don't get to where you have the big party and all the, the simcha dancing. But people do feel, a sense of loss about that. And I think we want to make room in our hearts for that kind of pastoral situation. Just moving along in the interests of time to the, acknowledging the stresses and strains of families who have been cooped up, certainly in Manhattan. There's legion stories of the people who are home with their 2 or 3 kids in a small apartment, trying to both work. And this is assuming that both parents have jobs that have, stayed intact, and to do homeschool for their kids and trying to figure out, and this is, I know people in other places around the world who were really not allowed to leave their homes, the stresses and strains inherent, in that kind of situation, the marital strains, if a child has special needs, and all, we could go on and on with that kind of thing. And, when we look at a hierarchy of difficulties that people have experienced during this pandemic, the situation I just described might sound pretty good. They both have jobs, kids are relatively healthy, et cetera, et cetera. But the stresses and strains of that can really be enormous. I think that getting to the question that somebody, or the situation that somebody brought up, the situation of people in an older phase of life. I'm thinking about a patient that I'm working with, who is a woman in her later 60s, who has she has a number of children, but one adult son has not been a particularly responsible son. And he is divorced, he has a whole bunch of other stuff going on. He's acted quite irresponsibly to his own children, including one who does have significant special needs. And my patient and her husband, the grandparents, have been incredible supports for those grandchildren. They have really created a Jewish environment. They go to this other city every month to 2 months and bring Shabbos and bring gifts and teach and all kinds of stuff. Obviously, during the pandemic, this was not possible. And the level of anxiety and agitation and enormous irritability in my patient, who's like, 68, 69 years old, was staggering. She was just jumping out of her skin, so upset, so frustrated. And it was kind of spilling out all over, like being angry. If I was angry at CVS about the cards, she was absolutely exploding in other places. And wanting it all to be over, getting angry at people for taking it seriously, taking the pandemic seriously. I heard her saying, and this is all over Zoom sessions or over the phone, like, I could get hit by a car tomorrow. I don't want to wear a mask anymore. Now, that's not a good thing to be saying. That kind of level of like, oh, I can't take anymore. I just want it to be over. I'm just like done with it, can lead people to do really foolish things. Not wearing a mask, in a city or any place is a foolish thing. I do want to bring up, and I thank the person who wrote in about second generation, since that's me too. I mean, second generation of Holocaust survivors. I know that I thought about this an enormous amount. I have my mother, who turned 92 recently and is very cognitively and physically intact, lives in an adult independent living situation, but it takes me about 45 minutes to get there. And for me, I spent a tremendous amount of time thinking, what am I going to do if COVID enters her apartment complex? Am I going to go in there with her? What if it's, and I would think over, and I even wrote to the administrators who did a fabulous job, I have to say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Because the idea that after everything my mother went through, that she would have to endure this. I mean, she was, whatever, it doesn't really matter what her particular story was. Anybody who lived through the Holocaust had some horrible, isolated, years long type of thing. I couldn't imagine that this would be my mother's end. Now, thank God she's been okay. And so far, so good. I mean, it's been very isolated and lonely. But I think that I can only imagine that other people, and I did talk to other people who are also children of survivors, some who did lose parents during this and did very heroic or extreme things to be with these parents or to connect with these parents. I think that the anxiety of that was pretty intense. Do I know that it was more intense? I would never say that than other people who have aged parents who they love dearly and certainly experience other things in their lives. But as a Jewish community, we're particularly sensitive to the Holocaust, and anybody who is alive today, who is a Holocaust survivor, has got to be at least 85 or 90 years old. So this is really the end of the end. The stars are going out, and we feel particularly, I think, protective and special towards them. So again, I think that when we hear any of these stories, whether it's the single young men or older, not even young, men and women who would like to be partnered and feel that they're frozen in time, whether it's a postpartum young mother who is struggling, whether it's a person in their later 60s, we automatically jump to solutions. We think like, how can we help these people? What can we do? And I've always it's always great to hear your students say, what you taught them. But and I didn't make up that moniker of wait, why am I talking? But so we jump into solution thinking, like doing mode. And so much of the time, especially with these situations, it's really holding the space. It's really let's say with this, I mean, I can't produce, a proper boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse for somebody who's hankering for that. I couldn't do it pre-corona. I certainly can't do it during, COVID. But I can say this really matters, and I want you to hold on to this. And I want to think about, what's this touching off for you, and what can you plan for afterwards? And how about trying again, here I am going into action mode myself, but like really trying to help somebody explore what they can find their resilience, find their strength, find where they can be active themselves, and not try to solutions are really important. But in our business, the chaplaincy world, the psychotherapy world, this realm of the spirit, our solutions are more intangible, and they're more helping people feel cared for, feeling validated, and helping them to find their own sources of resilience. So I'm going to stop now because we have 5 minutes, great, to open up to anything that anybody wants to talk about. Rabbi Jason, if you want to comment on any of the things that I said, please go ahead. We're looking at the chat.
Sure. There was an interesting comment someone sent to me privately that I think is worth mentioning publicly. They were asking about when something could be classified as being urgent or emergent when it comes to emotional distress in halacha. And it's actually a really fascinating topic. I mean, it would take an hour to really do that topic properly. So I'm obviously just going to give it just in one quick minute, but halacha definitely takes very seriously emotional distress as a part of pekuach nefesh. We call it yisuv daita or yishuv hadas, or like the Mishnah in Shabbos refers to a woman giving birth on Shabbos, that you can light a candle for her, for the midwife who's helping her to give birth. And the Meforshim say that's even in the case where the woman herself is blind. So meaning, why does she need the light? Just because it makes her feel better to know that the light is being turned on. It's kind of like this case that's been going around lately about Rav Soloveitchik when he was a baby, that his grandfather said, even if the doctor says he doesn't really need it, just turn on do whatever you need to for pekuach nefesh. So the same thing applies for emotional distress. So much so that when I first became a chaplain, I asked Rav Asher Weiss if I could ever, in the way that doctors do carry a pager or their phone on Shabbos to respond on Shabbos, if I would be able to do that as a chaplain. And he said, if you really needed to, and you could determine that it was a level of pekuach nefesh, of emotional support for someone, which sometimes it can be, then I would support you doing that. I've been able to not have to do that. But similarly, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, Zichrono Livracha, published a tshuva, and Rav Asher Weiss has now published a tshuva on this topic, that a social worker can go to a bombing, God forbid, after, on Shabbos, even if it means driving, to provide emotional support for the people there, because we treat emotional support as a category of pekuach nefesh. So that there's a lot to say about it, but just to mention very briefly, that is definitely within the halachic confines of the pekuach nefesh discussion when it comes to providing emotional, spiritual care for people in severe distress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dr. Friedman, you want to have the last word for half a minute, 1 minute or so?
Thank you. I think that anybody, by virtue of being on this program and listening, is a first responder, is a potential spiritual caregiver. And I urge you all to, reach out and to see if you're in your own communities, even having like a niche support group, let's say for the singles living alone, 3 sessions facilitated maybe by a psychologist, a social worker, somebody like that in the community, is so dignifying. It's, first of all, it does provide obviously support, but it's also saying this matters. And I think that this is a low cost. It really requires a little bit of organization, some vetting, but that's what I would really urge people to do, is to form niche support groups that are short term and see where they go.
Thank you. Laser, you want to wrap it up?
I just wanted to thank both Dr. Friedman and Rabbi Weiner for an amazing presentation and some really thought-provoking ideas. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
Okay, pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. We're going to take a 4.5 minute break and come back with Dr. Ryback. Go get a cup of coffee, a drink, a muffin, say hello to other people in the family, invite some friends to come on, And
Only 4.5 minutes, right, Jay? Perfect.
approximately 4.5 minutes. Dr. Ryback, welcome. You have to unmute yourself. You are a co-host now?
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem shalom. Okay, Dr. Ryback was going to be a first-time speaker at JME this year at our conference. So we haven't met yet, and nice to meet you, at least over Zoom.
Likewise.
Okay.
Did you try the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
So let me,
I don't know if
It's-
you're wrong.
so just direct me. Hang on. So share screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on the bottom. You should be able to share your screen as a co-host. And then anything open on your computer should pop up.
Okay, one moment.
So you have to open your PowerPoint first.
Okay, hang on. Okay,
And then hit share. You'll see on the bottom right, there should be go on the PowerPoint presentation. It should show up. And then there, okay. Very good.
Wonderful.
Okay, you see?
okay, fabulous.
Okay. All right, I'll be back in 2 minutes or so, and we'll see you soon. How
Great.
much 4.5 minutes is left? Okay.
So you were able to work it out. You got into work today and back.
Yeah, it worked out. I got home at about 2 o'clock. So I changed, I got all ready.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, you know what? It was fun doing this because putting the pieces of the puzzle together was people's schedules, people's time zones, and people's other commitments. And by the time we finished the jigsaw puzzle, we were pleased. So glad you're able to get to work this morning.
Good. Listen, thank you for this opportunity. Can I check with you just later on in the slideshow when I put it, I can see it nicely on a desktop, but if you take a look, are you able to read, for example, this tshuva? Is it too small on your screen or is it readable?
No, it's fine. I mean, it's not the most in focus, but you know, certainly they're all legible.
Okay, this one too?
Yeah.
Okay, fine, good. That was my biggest worry, how it would transmit over the Zoom. Okay.
Okay. No worries about worries. Okay. We'll get everybody here back together and then we'll
Great.
begin.
My parents might log on just for this session. I told them if they look on this session, I'll ask for special gratis. If they're going to look on tonight as well, they weren't able to look this morning, then they'll certainly register appropriately. But to me, it never matters since we spell it with a Y. But if my parents are listening, it's always the family name. I spell Ryback with a Y. So when someone says Ryback, it's technically totally correct. But it's a Ryback, just in case my parents are listening.
Okay, so I'm sure they'll enjoy the nachas, and I'm sure that we'll do our best. Ryback. I went to yeshiva with someone who was Ryback from Muncie, so that's how I'm familiar with the name. Obviously, no relation.
It's an old Polish name. It means fisherman in Polish.
Aha. All right. I remember that was the name, a Muncie family of all.
Yeah.
So
could be distant, distant relatives.
Laser, is your stopwatch on about a minute and a quarter?
I think we have less. I think we're ready to go.
Okay, give it 45 seconds. I don't think it was quite 4.5. I don't have a second watch on my watch. I only have the minutes. All right.
It's hard to get the messages. People are sending messages to the speaker. It's hard to focus on that, but
you ignore them. You ignore them.
I'm
a New Yorker, so I can talk fast and I'll plow through them and leave time at the end for questions.
Rabbi Wiener, they want to do themselves, but all our speakers, you ignore the chat at the end. So you leave minutes at the end. We'll feed you the questions.
Perfect.
Okay, Laser, you can start.
Just give me 1 second, please. Let me just pull up our schedules and everything that I need. Right. Okay. All right. I think we're ready for the next session now.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think it's come up a few times already that the original intent was that we were going to celebrate our bat mitzvah year, and we were going to really focus on the issues around reproduction. With Corona coming in, we altered our plans, but we felt that it was very important nonetheless to still have some form of we'll call it a zecher to our original plans. Something which is absolutely not Corona, although Dr. Reback may tell us otherwise, but really discussing one of the original intentions, which was exploring some of the topics in advanced reproductive technologies. To address this, we had invited Dr. Reback, who is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist, who practices fertility medicine with Reproductive Medicine Associates of New Jersey. Dr. Reback, he holds an MD from Johns Hopkins and an MPH from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, did his training in OBGYN at Johns Hopkins, and then went on to a fellowship in reproductive endocrinology at Einstein Montefiore. And he is also a musmach from Yeshiva College and musmach of the REITs program. I know that I came across Dr. Reback when I was reading through the now unfortunately defunct Journal of Contemporary Halacha, where he wrote some very intriguing articles. So it's really with great pleasure, I would like to introduce you. And today we will be discussing specifically the issues of reimplantation genetic diagnoses and some of the advanced reproductive issues in endocrinology. Dr. Reback.
Hi, Shalom Aleichem to everyone. It's my first experience on a Zoom teleconference, as well as lecturing at a conference. So any imperfections, my apologies. My thanks and gratitude to Torah in Motion, to Rabbi Kelman, and to Dr. Friedman for inviting me to speak. The title of my topic, Pre-implantation Genetic Diagnosis, Reluctant Diminishment in Jewish Law, or transferring last resort embryos after IVF and PGD known to be affected by genetic disease. There's quite a lot of definitional issues, and I will certainly attend to those. But just two quick pointers. One, I want to emphasize, of course, for the purposes of the CME, that I have no relevant disclosures or conflict of interest. I actually have that on a concluding slide, but I want to mention that up front. And two, in truth, there's no direct link to the COVID pandemic, other than the obvious. This is yet another manifestation where we fervently pray, V'hasirosi machala mikerbecha, be it infectious disease or be it genetic disease. And you know, in a perfect, perhaps messianic world, many of these topics will be somewhat irrelevant or moot. First, some definitional background. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, like many of the audience in medicine and in the lay fields who have been familiar with the literature in the last generation on halacha, and one of the most exciting areas of medical ethics and halacha is in reproduction and assisted reproduction, knows that PGD is lichatchila, or a priori selection against affected embryos. Instead of parents who are known to be carriers of genetic disease attempting pregnancy and then having to deal with prenatal diagnosis and possible severe she'elot on what to do with that pregnancy, couples in the last 30 years have been afforded the ability, increasingly so, to undergo in vitro fertilization, even in the absence of infertility, and then perform genetic diagnosis on the embryos before they're implanted back in the womb. Typically, PGD is done for severe monogenic diseases such as Tay-Sachs. In more recent years, even moderate diseases. And I'm going to use a very common mutation in the GJB2. We call it a very common non-syndromic deafness syndrome. So it's not part of a wide cognitive syndrome. It's isolated, moderate to severe deafness, which is common in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. Mild monogenic diseases, and there are many, I list one or two as examples, and predisposition syndromes, where PGD can conceivably be performed to select against an embryo that will certainly be healthy for the first decades of life, but might be a carrier for a cancer predisposition syndrome, such as the BRCA1 or 2 mutations. In recent years, this lichatchila selection against an affected, quote, unhealthy embryo was turned on its head by groups of parents who want what's called, or what the medical ethics literature has dubbed intentional diminishment, where PGD is geared to select for affected embryos. Parents who have dwarfism, one common cause is achondroplasia, an X-linked disease, and they want their children to join in their culture. And they do not view their condition as a disability, but rather as an opportunity to be part of a distinct culture. They have approached medicine, and it's created obviously a controversy, seeking to select embryos that have that achondroplasia mutation and will, just like the parents, have the dwarfism. Likewise, deaf parents have approached fertility centers throughout North America. Again, it's not common, but enough that this is a well-known issue in the medical ethics literature, seeking to have a deaf embryo implanted, again, to join in their culture, viewing deafness not as a disability, but as part of a culture. Based on this background, I would like to coin a term. I haven't seen it in the literature. The literature does use the term last resort embryos, but to use the term reluctant diminishment. B'diavad requests, lechatchila b'diavad are beautiful Talmudic terms that don't lend easily to translation in the English language or in medical literature when decision-making is made. But b'diavad requests by couples whose attempts at IVF and PGD for disease-free embryos have failed. And now at the end of their journey in assisted reproduction, they now request embryo transfer of the last resort affected embryo. Our learning objectives: 1, to better appreciate the complex ethical considerations arising from contemporary practice in PGD, and 2, to understand some of the considerations relevant to the Judaic approach towards reluctant diminishment, the transfer of a last resort affected embryo. The outline, and I would like to take you through, and in the next, say, 40 minutes or less, we will get through a brief overview, a very brief overview of IVF and PGD, indications for PGD, some of the ethical conundra in the last generation, 1990 to 2010, current dilemmas, both that are undertaken in the secular bioethics literature and then reflected as well, of course, in our halachic literature. IVF PGD best current practices. The way IVF is practiced today in leading centers is very different than the way it was just 10 or even 5 years ago. For those that may be more familiar, and I'll try to make this as accessible as possible, some of the items of best current practices, which also have propelled us more into this quandary of dealing with last resort embryos. 1, universal blastocyst culture and cryopreservation. Now, an IVF cycle is always a 2-stage process. 1, we grow the embryo until the embryo is about a week old. At that point, it's known as a blastocyst. And at that point, the embryo is biopsied. No longer are embryos biopsied for PGD on day 3 with quick results that may come back in a day or 2. Biopsying the early embryo has been shown to negatively affect the implantation. So embryos are grown for a week, then they're frozen. Before the freeze, they're biopsied for genetic determination. In addition, partly at our center, Army, New Jersey, the idea of not just testing an embryo for the specific gene in question, such as Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, and typically much more rarer genes that have not been picked up by Dor Yesharim or the other common preconceptual testing in the Orthodox community. But at the same time, to appreciate that particularly as women go through the reproductive years, an increasing burden of aneuploidy, meaning women, as I'll show you in a slide in a bit, women in the late 30s and 40s have a dramatic high percentage of chromosomally normal embryos, eggs and therefore embryos. Hence, the vast majority of available embryos, before we even get to testing for the autosomal dominant or recessive gene of question, already that embryo will be chromosomally abnormal and not compatible with a successful pregnancy. So simultaneously testing is critical in the effort to have success. And finally, increasing widespread use of preconceptual pan-ethnic genetic screening tests. I list some of the many that are common, at least in the Northeast, in the greater New Jersey, New York area. Dor Yesharim does a wonderful job at reducing the risk of transmission for the 15 or 20 diseases that they look at. Dor Yesharim has made a policy decision. It is a very understandable one. It is one that is not without controversy, that they look at some of the, quote, biggest and baddest genetic diseases. But some of those that might be equally or almost as severe, but are a little bit less common, are not part of the Dor Yesharim or even the supplemental Dor Yesharim panel. Therefore, the risk reduction, which is the term used, by how much can a couple say, thank goodness, we seem safe from genetic disease? The answer is nobody can ever say that with 100% certitude, since we never know for sure. There are certainly plenty of diseases unknown. But the broader the preconceptual genetic test, the greater the residual risk reduction has been. And now that couples beyond Dor Yesharim can do, for example, SEMA4, a commercially available test that looks at 283 diseases, couples are increasingly finding severe, moderate, and mild diseases beyond the panel of Dor Yesharim. Now they're already married, they have a binyan ne'eman, they're already a couple, and often they will now seek PGD for perhaps moderate or even mild disease. Again, this is just a quick review for anyone who may be a little bit more familiar, but rather than belabor this slide, just some very important points. When I have a couple coming for a first visit and I want to take them through IVF, it's like a painter painting layers of paint. There's way too much information at one point. So what I tell them is that IVF, we just finished a short time ago Klal Gadol in the Daf Yomi. IVF has two klalim. One, the brain every month releases in a normal menstrual cycle a finite amount of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. The first rule of IVF is that on IVF, we will give a higher dose of hormone. Our goal is to obtain many eggs. That is the first rule of IVF. And the second rule of IVF is that there is inevitable embryological attrition in the lab. The number of eggs that a woman starts out with, particularly in a PGD cycle, needs to be a high number. Why? Because not every egg will be mature. Not every mature egg will successfully fertilize with sperm and create a day one embryo. Not all of those embryos. In fact, only between 1/3 and 1/2 of embryos, meaning of eggs that fertilize, grow successfully in the lab up to the blastocyst, the 1-week-old stage. And then of those blastocysts that are biopsied for PGD, only a small fraction will be PGD normal. What is the major difficulty, impediment, or brick wall that we have? Aneuploidy. And this is a slide that comes out of a study at RMA New Jersey, looking at 15,000 cycles of patients, looking at, 15,000 number of embryos. The N on the right side is 15,169 embryos. Take a look for women in the later reproductive years, where you have about 75% of available embryos. Before you get to look at the cystic fibrosis or whatever monogene you're looking at, already a very high percentage are chromosomally abnormal. Just to avoid confusion with people who have a passing interest in the field, PGD is known, or has been known in recent years, until recently when the terms have been changed. PGD was reserved as a generic description for any genetic testing of a pre-implantation embryo. And that's often the term you see in the secular and halachic literature. But it also was specifically referred to single gene testing, where chromosomal testing was known as PGS, or pre-implantation genetic screening. Recently, the terminology was changed, and that's an ongoing alphabet soup in medicine. Specific types of PGD. PGT-A refers to aneuploidy or chromosomal screening. The typical single gene PGD that's referred to, and that's ultimately our focus, is PGT-M, or single gene testing. And then PGT-SR, structural rearrangements, is for a more complex kind of PGD. I dealt with this a little bit in the beginning, but now as we get further into the topic, just to understand some of the specific indications and how we break them down. Severe diseases, moderate diseases, mild diseases. There are also predisposition syndromes, as you see on the slide, such as BRCA, which is the most common, and HLA matching, where parents, for example, both are carriers for Fanconi anemia, which is actually a common Ashkenazi disease, and it is on, of course, the Dor Yesharim panel. Often, a child with Fanconi anemia will also need a bone marrow transplant. When that happens, having a sibling, in the case where no close relative is a matched carrier, parents who then attempt PGD for a subsequent second child who's unaffected often have the ability as well to try to HLA match that child. There's a 25% chance that siblings are HLA matched so that that child can be a matched sibling. This is known as the savior sibling debate. We'll cover that briefly momentarily. And of course, chromosomal testing for aneuploidy and gender selection. Some of the ethical conundra that has bedeviled often the secular literature, ironically to an even greater degree than the halachic literature, is PGD obligatory? There are access questions, commodification questions. In many countries, the United States in particular, IVF and PGD is often not covered by insurance. So this becomes an area where there are great socioeconomic divides. Are we commodifying children in the sense, of course, we mean well when we try to remove diseases, but is it sort of like we're trying to perfect an otherwise imperfection? And again, this comes from the secular ethical literature. There's this notion of procreative beneficence. Are parents in a secular society obligated to do anything possible for the betterment of their children? And of course, that's a slippery slope to genetics. It may be a very far slippery slope, but it's one that's worth contemplating. Intentional diminishment. Deaf parents wanting a deaf child, dwarf parents wanting an achondroplastic child, elective gender selection, and the sexism that it evokes. What's interesting is that in the United States, it is generally allowed in fertility centers, not just gender balancing, when a family has a boy and now they want a girl or vice versa, but even for the first time, data is pretty clear that it's roughly 50-50 in terms of requests first time. But in other countries in the world, taking a look at the gender of an embryo before implantation is strictly prohibited because of a significant desire for only male offspring. And finally, the savior sibling debate, which I alluded to, when parents have a second child, specifically HLA matched to be a bone marrow donor for an older affected children. And in the secular literature, there's been a lot of hype, sometimes maybe even hysteria about different issues. This is a slide I have borrowed from Dr. Richard Scott. It comes from 1937, so we're looking at almost a century ago. And if you look at the bottom of the text, they're wondering, will it be possible to obtain son or daughter according to specification? And of course, Newsweek, maybe a decade ago, girl or boy, I forget how long ago I set up this slide. Now you can choose selection. And I'm sure this has been a topic that's been discussed. And in fact, in the halachic literature, for many, many years. The topic of the savior sibling is a very interesting topic. I don't want to belabor it more than just to illustrate that this is yet another scenario where in the secular literature, there was quite a bit of hysteria. And in the halachic literature, there's almost unanimous, not just allowance, but endorsement of having a second child, both on its own merits, but also as a savior for the first child. One pivotal case, and perhaps many in the audience who are my age and older remember, this was the cover of Time magazine almost 30 years ago. The older sister on the bottom, Anissa Ayala, desperately needed a bone marrow transplant. At that time, her mother was already in her 40s. This is a Hispanic couple from Southern California. The mother was already in her early 40s. Now that we all know what aneuploidy and how challenging it is to conceive in the early 40s, even if a woman's ovarian reserve is robust, it's still a big challenge. Not only that, but the father had a vasectomy. He had to reverse the vasectomy, a procedure that does not always work. Then they had to conceive and beat the barriers of advanced reproductive age. They conceived spontaneously, naturally. There's a 1 in 4 chance that that child will be a carrier. And little Marissa indeed, was compatible. Little Marissa was compatible to her sister Anissa, and indeed saved her life. You can Google this family and see, how the sisters have kept, together. Now they look almost 30 years older. And this is obviously a heartwarming story. From a Jewish perspective, it's hard to argue. There are certainly issues. Will that child be appreciated? There's certainly what to talk about. And I don't mean to, run roughshod over an interesting ethical issue, which is not actually our topic, however interesting it is. But take a look at the rather, in my feeling, hysterical secular responses by secular ethicists. These are not just talking heads, on a news show. Someone from the Hastings Center, the prestigious Center of Medical Ethics north of New York City. It is troublesome, to say the least. It's outrageous that people would go to this length. I mean, one has to ask, wouldn't any parent go to that length? Alexander Morgan Capron, an ethicist at USC, one of the fundamental precepts of ethics is that each person is an end in himself or herself and is never to be used solely as a means to another person's ends. A few years later in England, the United Kingdom is governed by a centralized authority when it comes to fertility. There are benefits, perhaps, but there are certainly drawbacks. In that decision, this family was not allowed to undertake PGD to save a child and have a younger sibling. So this mother went to Chicago. This is the quote famous Whitaker. Also, for anyone interested, can Google Jamie Whitaker. And indeed, she had the savior sibling. Subsequently, in England, they changed their protocols and rules, and they do allow this over there. In terms of current dilemmas from 2010 to present, there are many technical issues on how we counsel patients that involve both clinical and ethical dilemmas. And those are the technical dilemmas. Just for the sake of being complete, I put them on the slide. But the fundamental issue, and this brings us to the bread and butter, what I would like to talk about, reluctant diminishment and where do we draw the line? Imagine that you're a physician sitting with a couple before you. Two classical but very similar scenarios. A patient with diminished ovarian reserve, the scientific or politically correct way for aging ovaries, and or advanced reproductive age. She is now status post 3 consecutive IVF cycles with no usable blastocysts. This couple has but 1 affected embryo from her initial round of IVF. Or similarly, a patient has now undergone 6 cycles of IVF PGD, and the patient is depleted emotionally, physically, financially. She's done with IVF. She has but 1 affected embryo from prior IVF. Would you transfer? On the top slide, just as an example, familial Mediterranean fever is an incredibly, for the vast majority of patients, benign condition. Now that many patients are doing broad-based testing, I've had this scenario repeatedly where a parent comes back not as a carrier, but as a homozygous affected individual. And I turn to the parent, whether it's the husband or wife, and I say, you're the same person you were 2 weeks ago. I said, your health is the same. Maybe they have a vague recollection that they had more fevers of unexplained origin as a child than their siblings or than their friends. But for the vast majority of patients, that's it in terms of the intensity of the disease. If a couple, and it's questionable if a couple should even undergo PGD, we certainly don't require patients to undergo PGD for familial Mediterranean fever. But let's say a couple wanted to lechatchila, and now b'diavad, only embryos that they have that disease. Would you feel comfortable? And I presume that many of you in the audience would. I certainly would. Of course, as a physician, we always worry about the medical legal climate and making sure a patient was consented. So having a specific genetic counseling session is what's required. But ultimately, I feel comfortable allowing a patient to transfer. What about Gaucher's disease? It does have variable severity. Some are very mild, some aren't. What about a healthy female who happens to be a carrier of a lethal X-linked trait? Often when parents have an X-linked disease, they want to transfer an unaffected male or a female who's not a carrier, because if they transfer a female who's a carrier, the next generation is obligated to undergo IVF and PGD. So this female will be healthy, but a carrier. And I think it's easy to someone to justify that if parents have no other embryos and want to transfer this female will be perfectly healthy. At the end of the day, she'll have to do IVF and PGD when it's time for her childbearing. But then again, so does many others in society. The fact that we know this in advance is not necessarily or should not be justification not to transfer that embryo. What about a BRCA mutation? That's very interesting onto itself. Klinefelter, and I've tried, and my moral compass is not a divine moral compass. All of us who look at this will certainly have perhaps a different way. And if someone takes a screenshot of this slide, there are certainly other ways of stratifying, however many. There's about 10 cases from the most minor to the most severe. Obviously, I don't think there's a responsible doctor on the planet that would transfer a Tay-Sachs embryo, even to parents desperate for any childbearing. A Tay-Sachs baby obviously is doomed at a very, very early age. But somewhere in between is where each and every one of us, I think, will feel that they're drawing the line. In the secular bioethics literature, the big debate and the terminology used, reproductive liberty, the role of equal protection, I'll explain in a moment, versus physician professional conscience, exposure to legal liability, reproductive non-maleficence, first, do no harm, procreative beneficence, doing our best for the next generation, child welfare. There's a very interesting philosophical debate. Is a child better off born even with some sort of handicap or condition or disability or disease or not? And of course, the impact on third parties, which may sound like an interesting secular concern, but it's actually found in the halachic literature in one of the tshuvot that I will be citing. In terms of reproductive liberty, or the secular argument in favor of allowing parents to transfer just about any embryo that is affected, society does not force a termination of pregnancy affected with genetic disease. I see someone's coloring. Hence, fertility centers may not deny transfer of an affected embryo. There's also the non-identity problem that existence is also superior to non-existence by many, philosophical thinkers, versus a physician may prioritize avoidance of known morbidity in offspring over the parental goal of parenthood. Now I understand what it's like when my wife is doing Zoom with the children for classes and suddenly there's a lot of graffiti and, I never knew. But hold up on the graffiti just a few more minutes.
Dr. Reback, if you just tap on your screen on the top, you can clear it. There would be an option.
Hang on and I'll try.
You're the only one. It's actually inadvertently coming from you. Your mouse has become a pen.
Ah, so how do I do this? It's under annotate or?
Yes. Clear the screen.
Okay. Thank you.
Wonderful. Your mouse is still animating.
I'm wondering what I'm doing. Let me see. Maybe it's the.
Yeah, you're in pen format. You need to get away from the pen. Clear it, and you see that the mouse is now a pen. You just want a pointer.
So how do I get rid of the pen?
So first clear it. Clear your marks, like you just did, and now tap up again, and you'll become a pointer. Right now you're a pen.
Okay. Oh. No, I'm a pen again. So I'll keep it at the bottom of the screen.
Right.
Okay.
Now you're a pointer.
Thank you. Pardon me. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine governs the practices of our field the way the American Heart Association, for example, does so for cardiologists. They penned an ethics committee opinion about 2.5 years ago, transferring embryos with genetic anomalies detected in pre-implantation testing. Valid and reasoned arguments exist to support provider decisions to either assist in transferring genetically anomalous embryos or to decline to assist in such transfers. If a child is highly likely to be born with a life-threatening condition that causes severe and early debility with no possibility of reasonable function, think Tay-Sachs, it is ethically acceptable to decline. Physician assistance in the transfer of such embryos is ethically problematic and therefore highly discouraged. If a child is highly likely to be born with a treatable or manageable condition, it is ethically acceptable to transfer such embryos upon patient request. Provider refusals also fall within appropriate ethical boundaries, so long as they are non-arbitrary and do not discriminate against the patient on any basis. From Europe, there was a wide discussion among fertility practitioners in the different countries in the EU, how they feel, and it's just interesting to voice, and again, this is coming from a strictly secular approach. Does it matter that parents change their minds? The transition from the Chadchila to B'diavad, is it significant? Patients willing, so according to these opinions, and again, this is just reflecting different segments of a physician practice in Europe, patients willing to eventually accept an affected last chance embryo should use IVF, but not burden professionals and society with efforts and costs of testing them, PGD, and then if the result is not to your liking, say thank you very much, but we will take the embryo. And one can look at this and say, I don't find this to be a very compelling argument. If you feel that way, certainly, to an extent I do too. Would the child be fully accepted? Such patients don't want the disease, and then they change their mind just because their eagerness to have a child is more important than selecting to avoid a disease. Other practitioners do not find this transition to be important at all or to be problematic. They wanted to have a healthy child, the parents, but at the end, they realized that this is not possible. And then option 2 came up. This is the normal way you take decisions. It's what you also do when you are going shopping or something, lahavdil. So this is a stepwise process. And for these patients, the conditions are now different. They no longer have the ideal embryo, and they would like now to at least transfer an embryo. What about PGD in halacha? The most important pasuk, I would say, in the practice of PGD, and I'm going to show 2 classic tshuvas, which are about 30 years old. So the technology and the practice of PGD has really only taken off, I would say, in the last 15 years or so, or the last decade. But these tshuvas were written by Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein, Shlita, as well as by Rav Chaim David Halevi, who was Zichrono Livracha, former chief rabbi, Sephardic chief rabbi in Tel Aviv. Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damoy shofech. It's a famous pasuk from Parshas Noach. He who sheds the blood of man, in man or by man. So the flexibility of translating ba'adam, shall his blood be shed. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, who is a man in man? This is the fetus in utero. So when is capital murder, or when is murder a capital offense? When it is man in man. But when the embryo is in its pre-implantation stage, it has absolutely no status in Jewish law. Indeed, this idea about 40 days is very problematic, subject to a lot of question to its relevance. It seems that many people are familiar with the idea of, Maya Ba'alma, it's just water before 40 days, but that's actually very problematic in terms of a practical psak. However, it is a blanket statement that when that embryo is pre-implantation, still in the laboratory, that embryo is not considered of human status. And this has really opened the door very widely for the practice of PGD. The famous tshuva by Rav Zilberstein Shlita, this can be found on the web. It was published as a response to Dr. Richard Grazi in Brooklyn, and it's been in Asya as well as the subsequent compilation Svarim of Asya. So, pardon me as I try to mix my learning Ashkenazis with reading Hebrew Havara. Otam beitziot hapigiot lamachala. Those eggs that are affected, or embryos with the disease, mutar shelo lahashtilan. It is permissible not to transfer them. Umutar af lahashmidan. And it is mutar. I'll try to follow myself for those that it's a little bit blurry. It is permitted to destroy them. There is no isser. Ve'ein lebeitziot mufarot elu hanimtzot michus l'rechem din nefesh. These fertilized embryos outside the body in the laboratory do not have the din, the status of nefesh. V'hamashmidan, he who destroys them, eino begeder ma'abed nefesh. He who destroys them is not someone who's destroying a soul. Ki haTorah asra l'shpoch dam adam hanimtza ba'adam. This is referring to that pasuk in Noach. Murder is a man found in man. Ki mavur b'sefer Bereshis, shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishofech. Hakavana, the intent of the pasuk, l'chaye uber hanimtza ba'adam. This is an embryo found in a man. Koloma berechem imo, in the mother's womb. Avalo biyoto adain b'mifchana, but not when it is still in the lab. Kimokain ein reshut l'chalel Shabbat kidei latzil beitzot shel mifchana ki einan adayin begeder nefesh. Umutar l'chal Shabbos kidei latzilo nafsho shel misha kvar nolad. Avalo kidei lahatzil nafsho shel misha adayin lo nolad. Taking this halachic point to its logical conclusion, if there's a tragedy, a fire in the laboratory, and every fertility lab has several layers of protection, but if there's a flood, a fire, a power outage, according to this tshuva, those embryos cannot be saved on Shabbos as hatzalat nefasho, because they are not a nefesh. The second tshuva, which is very similar by Rav Chaim David Halevi, again, the former, one of the former Sephardic chief rabbis of Tel Aviv, he writes, Atem oskim, just skipping ahead, behafrayat mivchana, you're dealing with IVF. You accept those, which is the vast majority of poskim that allow IVF. I will answer the shelos. All eggs that are in the laboratory, these embryos are not considered an uber, considered a fetus. You may not be mechalel Shabbat for them. You're allowed to throw them away and discard them if they were not selected for transfer. And in fact, even without PGD, one of the basic differences between classic Catholicism and Orthodox Judaism is the nature of these embryos. Very religious, very devout Catholic patients have an enormous difficulty with IVF because once you have a fertilized embryo, that embryo is considered ensouled. It has a life. And the idea of having surplus or supernumerary embryos that will stay in the lab in liquid nitrogen in perpetuity, for them is murder. It's anathema. And therefore, in classic Catholic theology, IVF is not permitted. But in our case, it's not. But take a look at the last two lines. Mishum she'ein din hapala ela merechem ish dafka. Abortion, or the problems with abortion, are only from the womb. Kain hadin hu gabi liyisrael, both for Gentile and Jew. V'hu hadin l'goyim. Af shegam l'gabeim shaykh isra pala v'afilu toch arba'im yom. Even within 40 days, there are problems. And he's specifically talking for a Gentile case. But this 40 days is problematic. Aval b'mifchana, if it's pre-implantation in the lab, ein ka'amor isra klal. So these are the classic tshuvos on PGD for the prior, generation. If you call this is, the classic tshuvot that give lichatchila, not just allowance, but almost encouragement or perhaps obligation to perform PGD when dealing with a severe genetic disease. But now let's talk about more recent tshuvos and more recent halachic opinions, in the last several years. That will take us toward our question of reluctant diminishment. Does the obligation of procreation pru revu apply to parents at risk of transmitting a serious genetic disease to their children? Is PGD obligatory for such parents? To what extent are such parents obligated by considerations to protect their future child's welfare? On my final slide, I had the distinct pleasure to thank a mentor, a teacher, a colleague, Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman, who I know is one of the distinguished morning speakers. And not long ago, when I received that call from Rabbi Kelman and from Dr. Friedman, that what I'm very grateful for, this invitation to speak, I turned to Dr. Reichman and I said, help me with some modern shuvas in terms of accessing some of the more recent shuvas to speak specifically about reluctant diminishment. And he sent me a variety of sources. One is from a beautiful publication by the Pua Institute on Poriut, fertility, yuchsin, and genetica, on reproductive genetics. One of their Rabbanim at Pua, Harav Aryeh Katz, also penned in Tchumen, Tafshin Ayin Vav, this is 2016, a beautiful article, Mitzvat Peru Urevu, the mitzvah of procreating, Eitzel B'nei Zog, by a couple, Nosei Machala Genetit, who are carriers. I'm taking you to the Sikum, and this article, I believe, I'm not sure if it could be accessed online, but I have it, and Dr. Reichman have it, and certainly be happy to forward it. B'mikrim shel machalot torashtiyot kashot, severe heritable genetic diseases, nitan hayom lehimana, we can prevent me'oledet yeladim cholim, we could prevent the birth of sick children, be'emtsaot bitzua hafraya chutz gufit, by IVF, uvidikata ubarim, genetic investigation lifnei hachnasatam l'rechem, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. But tahalich, the process known as ivchun geneti trom hashrashti. This is the fancy word in the Hebrew literature for PGD. Efsharut zu muteret hilchatit. It's of course allowed al pi halacha. But avar in the past, hayu poskim shehetiru lezugot nosim lamachala torishtot kasha shechosheshim laholid yalad chola. They would allow couples who had a severe genetic disease. Poskim would allow such a couple lehimana to hold back meherayon umikiyum mitzvat periya verivya. Rabbanim would allow a couple to simply not have children if they were facing, two parents who discovered that they're both carriers of a severe genetic disease. Kayom, however, today, kishayesh efsharut ma'asit, where there's the possibility shemuteret hilchatit levada, to be sure shah uber bari, that this uber will be healthy, asur lehimana mikiyum mitzvat peru. It is asur to hold back. So he's giving a halachic psak. It is prohibited to not engage in this technology and to not have children. Mikivan sheholedet yeladim b'derech tivit alula legrom lahem sevel b'yisurim kashim b'achuzim gvohim. Having children naturally for these genetically affected parents it's going to inevitably end up with a severely affected child. Zugot shenasim lamachalat torashtiyot kasha mechuyavim. Such parents are mechuyavim al pi halacha, required lehishtamesh b'derech zu al menat lehimana meholedet yeladim cholim. They must undertake PGD. So there's a twofold psak here, that PGD is absolutely required, and these couples cannot conceive otherwise naturally and take a challenge. Moreover, this couple cannot neglect to do PGD to the extent of their ability, and there may be medical and financial barriers understood, because they are required in period of arivia. Yesh poskim shematirin lahafsik herayon shel uvarim cholim b'machalat torashtiyot kasha. Of course, as we know the literature, the Tzitz Eliezer was famous for allowing late-term terminations of pregnancy for Tay-Sachs. But according to the way Rav Aryeh Katz is writing, Lamrodzo, nevertheless, nira she'ein heter likanes milachatchila leherayon al menas lahafsiko b'shas hatzorech. It's very different a psak for a couple who comes during pregnancy than for a couple to say, we'll take a 25 or 50% chance of an affected child and then obtain the requisite heter to terminate a pregnancy. And the link of my talk with all the distinguished sessions before and after. Harav Shlomo Dichovsky was a very, I think he may have retired, a very prominent dayan in the Bezdin in Yerushalayim. He had a question of a couple that were tested and found to both be carriers. Nevertheless, they want to get married. Are they allowed to get married, knowing that they're both carriers of a severe disease? Chova alehem, he writes, this couple can get married, but lehishtamesh b'chol ha'emtzaim hadrushim l'miniat machalot genetiyot min hayeladim. They could get married, but they must undergo PGD. Alehem lahakpid al kiyum yachasim. They must contracept ba'ofen shetimana, to prevent knisa leherayon, pregnancy spontaneously b'derech tivit, naturally. Holedet yeladim teaseh. Having children in their case may be done ach v'rak, only be'emtzaot hafraya chutz gufit. It only can be through IVF and PGD. And then he summarizes, a woman and a man, both carriers of a genetic disease, even though they understand if it's recessive, they have a 25% chance of an affected child. If their condition that they both share, or that one of them rather shares, is dominant, it's a 50%. Only if they use IVF and PGD. And they will choose only the healthy ones. Like the previous tshuvot, there's no problem with destroying, non-transferring the affected embryos. They're not a man, they're not a fetus. They are not shofech dam adam ba'adam damai shofech. Now, this is interesting as as one sees a halachic approach to the idea that's been raised in the secular literature about child welfare and other considerations. Im heim chafatzin, if this couple wants to get married and to have regular unprotected relations, and they do not intend to use IVF and PGD, yesh limnoa zot mehem, one must hold this back. A man is not allowed, or a couple is not allowed, to enter in danger. Lamrot shemedubar b'yitzur shadayin lo nolad, even though the danger is to a creation, an offspring, a person that is not yet created. Yesh kan mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It is a violation of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. V'chein chiyuv miniat sevel. There's also an obligation to prevent suffering. Gami takanas hatzibor, because of public policy. Yelet sovel, an affected child who's suffering, gorem la'ol kaved al kupat hatzibor, will cost an enormous toll on the public coffers. Healthcare will be very expensive for an affected child. Name the genetic disease, the emotional distress, etc. V'gam mitakanas am Yisrael. He uses the pasuk. Banim atem l'Hashem Elokechem. You are children to Hashem your God. Uchedivrei Rashi sham. And as Rashi explains, Shebnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, tzrichim liot na'im. They need to be pleasant, healthy, v'lo kerchim u'megudadim, and not unhealthy and unsavory. So it's an interesting, very direct psak that, again, does not directly touch on reproductive diminishment, but it does, touch on some of the important halachic determinants that ultimately will determine when Yolamdenu Rabbeinu, when Rabbanim directly address that question. There's a beautiful article written by Rav Gavriel Goldman and Rav Menachem Borstein, just a summary article. If you take a look, he quotes, and I know I'm rushing a little bit this reference, but I want to get to the tshuva of Rav Asher Weiss and then to conclude. In the Pua Sefer that I showed a copy of, that Dr. Reichman had referred to me, Rav Yaakov Ariel writes that he views it as a requirement to undergo PGD for a dominant condition, where there's a 50% plus chance of an affected child. A recessive, it is mumlatz, but not necessarily required. Rav Lior has a different, different calculation. He feels that it is a chiyuv if it is a sakanat nefashot, if we're dealing with a genetic condition such as Tay-Sachs or any genetic condition that doesn't just affect quality of life, but is in fact something that can cause death. The footnotes reference Rav Moshe David Tendler, Shlita of Muncie, who no doubt many of the listeners know and know well and have heard with great pleasure. According to this, take a look over here, and I'll try to find where the reference over here. Harav Moshe Tendler, the bottom of reference 22, Hora Lagabi Nisaot Lebraka. So specifically regarding doing PGD for the BRCA predisposition mutation, right? The child will be born healthy, but by the time that child, let's say it's a female, by the time the woman is age 40, she will start having, or even earlier, a dramatically higher risk of breast and ovarian cancer. She'ain tzorech lasot PGD, lamrot shebichlal gishato hi shechova levatzea PGD b'machalot kashot. So Rabbi Tendler feels that for BRCA, then there's no requirement to perform PGD. This is not to say that he necessarily would oppose it, and I don't know his specific opinion on using on PGD for BRCA, but it does mention that in general, Rav Moshe David Tendler feels that performing PGD is a chova, is a requirement. For anyone who needs a little bit of English, it is a beautiful article written by Rabbi Gidon Weitzman from the Pua Center and some co-authors. And this can be obtained, do a quick screenshot online off PubMed or any search engine. There appears to be no specific reference in the classic Jewish literature related to this question. Are you held by the same moral bond to care for unborn children? When we consulted the current Israeli chief rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo Moshe Amar, he claimed that despite the lack of moral obligation to embryos ex vivo, we are ethically bound to care for their well-being, similar to the sentiments V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha from Rav Daichovsky Shlita. In addition, one is not permitted to fulfill the halachic requirement of procreation if this causes damage to another person, and this obviates the performance of the commandment. Thus, it could be defined as an obligation to undergo PGD. The final tshuva, Hagon Rav Usher Weiss. Rav Usher Weiss feels that a couple that has a genetic disease, they're both carriers, that such a couple should not in general rely on Shomer Pitzam Hashem, which is a halachic license to take risks in halacha. But here, this is Kol HaChomer HaStatistiki Munach Bekupsa. Here we know what the risks are. So it's not that they're just taking a random risk of and saying Shomer Pitzam Hashem. Only because it's so beautiful, the reference, Bahade Kavshi Derachmana Lamalach. We all know the famous Gemara in Brachot that Chizkiyahu, the king, did not have children because he saw in the future that he would have a wicked son, Menashe, among the most wicked kings, Menashe. And therefore he did not have kings. He was seriously ill, and he was faulted by Yeshaya the Navi that Bahade Kavshid Rahmana, don't look in Hashem's plans. You should have children anyway. And different poskim look at that and have referenced this in the tshuvas. Do parents have to, are they allowed to factor this in or not? And of course, one can say that Akol Bidei Shamayim Chutz Me'Yira Shamayim, which Rabbi Bakshi Doron mentions. There's a difference between not having children when one is worried about a genetic disease and one worrying about the Yirat Shamayim. Sof Davar, Navuach Ani Be'inyan Zeh. So he's debating Ach Natiat Libi B'Chai Gavna Paterhu Mipiri Verivia. So unlike the previous poskim, such as Rabbi Aryeh Katz and others, Rav Usher Weiss Shlita feels that in such a case where there's a severe genetic disease, a couple actually may be allowed to say, this is not Shomer Pesam Hashem, this is not a case where they're at fault of Bahade Kavshi Derachman Alamalach, but in such a case, not to have children is a legitimate option. But what he does say is, so the ein chovas ha-mitzvah, the chiyuv of Pirya Verivia, ela hamaseh hatavi sheyesh biyad ha'adam lasod, is only natural procreation. Aval eino mitzvah me'ikar adin lehitasek be'emtzeim lo tivim. A person does not have to employ assisted reproduction, kamodal, like this. Af she'ein zu chova gemura, even though this is not an absolute obligation to invoke PGD, we should encourage them to undertake PGD. With all our strength, they should bring healthy children. Zara ma'alya. In my opinion, it is clear, even though there is no chiyuv to have Pirya Verivia in a situation where parents are genetic carriers, yesh b'zeh mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to undergo IVF and PGD. Which is interesting. There's the older generation debate of whether a person is mekayim de oraisa Pirya Verivia with IVF. Many poskim say yes, but even there are some that say no, but a person is mekayim lashevet, a rabbinic fulfillment. But he feels that it is Mekayim Pirya Verivia. The Mikol Makom, Hevi La'olam Zera Shel Kayama. There's of course Shevet, and all the Segulot, Hatzumot Shalamadnu Midivrei Chazal, Ein Ben David Ba. Mashiach will not come Yichlu Neshamas Shabaguf, right? Until we have all of the Neshamas. My final two slides. Would poskim who mandate PGD to prevent the suffering of affected offspring allow the transfer of last resort embryos? Could this be allowed even if a posek rules that Pru Revu is not fulfilled when a sick child is born? What does V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha? To what extent are we balancing childlessness? This is a couple that otherwise will have no children. How far can we push our V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha for them versus for the burden of disease for a child? And to what extent do Chachamim view life in and of itself as always superior to no life? Now, a lot of these tshuvas, and I leave it for the audience to sift through, none of them discussed reluctant diminishment. I've actually, written, and hope, one day to get answers. I didn't have much lead time, to get a tshuva may take a few months for these kind of questions. They certainly will be discussed because we're testing for more genetic disease preconceptually, and these results will be discussed by our Rabbeinu, our Rabbeim, Yelamdeinu Rabbeinu. On my final slide, I want to acknowledge again, these halachic sources are priceless and not that easy to get a hold of. And I want to thank my colleague, Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman. And of course, in the last few moments, to entertain questions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Reback. That there's a lot to that people want to engage in some questions. I'm going to begin immediately with one which deals with the financial considerations. Having explained to us that there is either a chiyuv or at least at the very least a heter, where does the role of the finances? You can speak to both the numbers in the United States, insurance issues. Who's going to take the burden of this, even if we do have a heter or a chiyuv?
Very good and very fair question. In Israel, and it's a true Kiddush Hashem in many ways, linking it to our other topic, a Kiddush Hashem, the way Israel has so successfully, we hope, handled the corona pandemic. Likewise, Israel has a very forward-thinking approach. In Israel, Kupat Cholim pays for IVF and, of course, for single gene PGD up to the birth of 2 children. I don't think that's changed recently, but that's from the last time I checked. And that's a very generous mandate, if you will. And obviously, Israel is governed by the Jewish virtues of the next generation and Pirya Verivya. In the United States, it is much different. A person's ability to engage in fertility has everything to do with whether they do or do not have infertility coverage. And if they don't have infertility coverage, it can be a huge burden. An IVF and PGD cycle at a good fertility center, can be $25,000, throwing out that number. If a person is successful, that's just 1 year of high school tuition. If a person isn't successful, it's very embittering and can, leads to yet another cycle. And some patients eventually reach the point where they cannot. The frum community has mobilized, and there are wonderful organizations that raise funding for couples who are engaged in fertility and don't have the finances or don't have the insurance. Insurance also in the United States is usually based by state. In my state of New Jersey, there is a rather generous mandate. Surrounding states, not the same, but increasingly more and more states are mandating a degree of coverage for IVF. And typically, if there's a single gene issue, that will be covered. But the bottom line is that this often, or for many couples, can be a failing of the United States healthcare, where couples may find that this desperate need for IVF and PGD is not covered by their insurance.
But if I can just push this idea, because I think it's going to be, it's relevant. Do you see a role for the Jewish community to absorb a new level of funding this type of activity? So we take care of education and we pay, and those that pay can pay for themselves. Those that cannot, the community pays. Do you envision that there's going to be now communities that are going to have specific fundraising just for the PGD population?
So absolutely, it has been done, throughout North America and will continue. For example, Bonei Olam is an organization that raises money. Every year in my local, hometown of Passaic Clifton, I'm proudly on the committee. We raise money, and every community tries to raise money for their own community. Aniye Ircha Kodman, and every community is a Raven Zelazeh for their own community. So this has been done, and there are many organizations that raise money for this. I think the public consciousness has only increased in the last several years as our genetic awareness has. So to answer your question it's very important. It has been done, and I think it will be done to a increasingly broad spectrum, over the next years.
So Rabbi Reback, if I can, Rabbi and Doctor, if I can address the next two questions, which I'm going to roll into one, and it basically speaks to the same idea, which is the slippery slope. How far do you envision this is going to continue in terms of genetic conditions? So specifically with regards to PGD, and then ultimately, if we expand that to whole genome sequencing, ein l'davar sof. At what point does one say that we need to draw a line in the sand somewhere? So
I want to answer this question directly and to reassure it's a frequently raised question. It's a very legitimate question. Ultimately, sometimes, if I'm on a panel, I would defer to a geneticist, in terms of what's possible or not. But for right now, in clinical medicine, if a disease is not monogenic, if there is not one address in the human genome. So the human genome, think of a cell like a computer, which is broken down into the chromosomes. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes in every cell. Those are the folders with data or genes. Unless a specific genetic condition has a specific address as a monogenetic condition, such as the BRCA gene, BRCA1 is found on chromosome 17. Unless it's monogenetic, for the foreseeable future, and maybe for no one says, never say never, it is not possible to select many of the traits that worry many commentators and people observing the field. Science is nowhere near selecting for blue eyes or I have brown eyes or for blonde looks or for any specific traits of appearance, intellect. So the idea that a master race is going to be even remotely possible, is still not even remotely on the horizon. That being said, one day, anything is possible. But I think that as long as we are selecting traits that are legitimately called a disease, whether or not it has mild impairment or whether it has moderate or severe impairment, I think that we are on very solid footing, both in the general secular ethical sphere and certainly, in halacha, as we are taking the charge of v'rapo yirapeh.
Okay. I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions. The issue of CRISPR technology, which has been discussed at this conference in the past, do you see a role of that at a nexus with PGD?
Certainly. Well, so what's interesting is the big promise of CRISPR ultimately would be gene modification.
Maybe if you want to give a two-sentence explanation to what CRISPR is for those that did not attend the conferences.
So CRISPR is just one of many gene editing techniques. So what PGD does is PGD is a powerful technology to detect a genetically abnormal embryo. For example, two parents that are both healthy but Tay-Sachs carriers, 25% of their offspring statistically might have Tay-Sachs. But wouldn't it be amazing if, let's say that couple did PGD, but the only embryos they have are affected by Tay-Sachs? We know which gene and which protein enzyme is affected in Tay-Sachs. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could do genetic engineering or genetic therapy or whatever term one wants to use and reintroduce that gene, whether it's at the embryonic level, at the fetal level, and therefore restore that embryo, fetus, etc., to a healthy status? So that's the ultimate promise. It's certainly something that is plausible. Whether it happens, in the next decade or next century, that remains to be seen.
Well, maybe that's a good spot to end right now, and then we have something to work on for maybe the next year as well. So I think we're going to close this session now, and I want to thank again once again our panelists this afternoon, Dr. Reback, Dr. Friedman, and Rabbi Weiner, really for a wonderful session this afternoon. Enjoy your afternoon break, take a little stretch, and we'll hope to see you all this evening again at 7 p.m.
Thank you so much.
Our pleasure, really. Thank you.
All right. Look forward to see you, as Dr. Leisure says. 7 o'clock, Dr. Pelkowitz on mental health issues and the community because of COVID. 8 o'clock, our panel, Rabbi Daniel Karofka, who's not only, of course, a Rav in Toronto, Dr. Leisure's Rav, he's the president of the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America. Yoni Goldstein, the editor of the now defunct during COVID Canadian Jewish News for the last number of years, and Rachel Levitt Klein-Dratch, who works at Prisma and education issues. So we have community, shuls, education, and a panel what our community should and would and might look like after, please God, this all ends and we get back to quote unquote semi-normal. So we invite you to come, bring your friends, tell your friends about it for the evening session, and been a wonderfully inspiring day. If I can say, I always come back inspired from our conference live, and it's, of course, it's not the same thing, but it's okay substitute, I guess. It's the best we can do. So we look forward to seeing you all in about a little bit less than 3 hours. Okay, enjoy your dinner.
You again.
And thank you very much. And again, and we're going to end the session. You'll have to log back in again, like at 6:45 or so. Thank you.
Karen, come over here, look. Yeah, come.
I will unmute people in case anybody wants to, Thank you, doctor.
Going to the garbage.
I'll mute people again. I don't know.
Going to the garbage mail.
Okay, so now it's a girl.
Okay.